About 200 years ago, the world changed fundamentally when the Industrial Revolution ignited a set of technological and economic changes that vastly increased living standards.
The American middle class was built on the back of routine work. You can think about routine physical work, that's an assembly line worker in a factory, or routine cognitive work, that's the payroll clerk in that same factory. Both of those jobs are going away very quickly.
There's growing unease about what the future looks like. People feel that technology is starting to run away with itself, and humans are being left behind.
One of the challenges we're facing today is that about half the population in the United States and other developed countries does not share in this bounty that the second machine age is bringing. We can decide what the future of work looks like.
Big technology changes always force us to think hard and to do some things differently. This is one of those times.
Technology has always been destroying jobs, but it's also always been creating jobs. It's not what technology does to us, it's what we do with technology.
We are not anywhere near peak jobs or peak labor. So this notion that that technology, that the robots are already eating away at all the jobs in America, it's just wrong.
Technology is not destiny. We shape our destiny. With the Inclusive Innovation Challenge, we are seeking to identify, recognize, and reward the innovators that are using technology for inclusion, for shared prosperity.
So what we're trying to encourage and celebrate is the next wave of job creating, wage increasing innovation and entrepreneurship that uses technology.
My name is Brenna Schneider. I'm the founder and CEO of 99 Degrees in Lawrence, Massachusetts. We're an apparel manufacturing company, and our vision is to build a future factory. And that future factory integrates the best of what humans can do with the best of machinery and automation. That technology allows us to reduce the number of labor minutes in each product we produce, and therefore the cost of producing that product.
We want to create over time a community of these kinds of inclusive innovators. And so we get some momentum around this idea that technology also provides opportunities for people.
One of the most fundamental things we can do is reinvent education. Think creatively, ask the right questions, have interpersonal skills, work in teams. Those are skills that machines can't do. In the second machine age, the desire to build and create things will become ever more valuable. We can leverage it with technology, and this could be the best thing that happened to most people.
One of the things we're trying to do with the Inclusive Innovation Challenge is rejigger things a bit, so we go attack the problems today that need attacking and give people more economic opportunity as they're helping address those challenges.
The Inclusive Innovation Challenge is essentially the solutions arm of the Initiative on the Digital Economy. The Initiative on the Digital Economy is very focused on research, convening ecosystem stakeholders. The Inclusive Innovation Challenge is starting to say, what are the solutions that are out there today that are actually addressing those challenges?
If you're an entrepreneur that's building and is motivated by both impact and scale, then this is the kind of challenge that can surround you with resources, build your network, and strengthen the foundation on which we're all growing together to make change in our own communities, in our countries, and across the world.
Let's not do things that are jumping way ahead of the current situation. So let's keep trying to get the educational system right. Let's keep trying to accelerate innovation and entrepreneurship.
This is not something that's predetermined by technology or by policy or by economic forces. It's something that we as entrepreneurs and as individuals can decide.
To have a competition that really fit with the model that we're building was exciting to me, and it's a bit rare.
We're looking for organizations that have solutions which are working today, and they're benefiting working people right now. They're beyond the idea phase and are in the implementation phase and are already succeeding.
The next decade could be the best decade in human history if we harness technology for the many, not just the few.
Good Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Devin Cook, and I'm the executive producer of the MIT Inclusive Innovation Challenge. And on behalf of the Inclusive Innovation Challenge, the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, and Google.org, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's panel, Building Skills for an Inclusive Economy. So as you just heard, the Inclusive Innovation Challenge is a $1 million awards program that awards prizes to organizations that are ensuring that prosperity in the digital economy is shared by reinventing the future of work. And we are open for applications at the moment, and we encourage you to either apply, share with your networks, and at the very least, mark your calendars for October 12th for our Gala Awards celebration in downtown Boston, where we'll be awarding prizes in 4 different categories: financial inclusion, technology access, income growth and job creation, and skills development and opportunity matching. And skills development is going to be the focus of our panel today. And I think you'll all agree, given that you're here today, that we would be hard-pressed to assemble a more knowledgeable, insightful, dare I say impressive group of panelists to discuss this topic. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Karen Miller, Erik Brynjolfsson, Speaker Robert DeLeo, Shawn Bohen, and Erik Schmidt.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. I think it's rare that you get leaders from government and nonprofits and academia and business to really come together in the same place and talk about an issue that's really crucial. I think coming out of the election, there were a lot of issues obviously on the table, but one of the ones that's generated a lot of headlines, but I'm not sure that it's generated quite as much substantive conversation, is this issue of the skills mismatch and the divide in the economy and the feeling that some people are doing great and some people are not feeling as great about where things are going or don't feel like they're included in it. So that's really what we want to talk about here today. Think about what businesses can do, what technology can do, what government can do. What nonprofits can do. And so I'll just give you a real quick intro of everybody. Erik Brynjolfsson, right here to my left, is a professor of management at MIT Sloan. He's director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. Robert DeLeo is speaker of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Shawn Bohen is national director for growth and impact at YearHub. And Erik Schmidt is the executive chairman of Alphabet. He's the former CEO of Google. We are going to talk for a while, and then at the end, we will take your questions. So if you have them, be thinking of them. Erik Brynjolfsson, I'm going to start with you. How do we know where the shortages are, where the skills mismatches are, where, if you're a leader in industry, you'd say, these are the problems, and this is what I would point to?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question that way, because too often I hear this meme going around that we're entering a world without work and there's just nothing left for people to do anymore. And that's a really dangerous and misleading meme, because as Devin was saying, there's huge opportunities for creating new kinds of jobs and new kinds of work using technology. And one of the ways you can see that is what's happening to wage structure. So as an economist, if you look at what's happening to wages, you see that there are places where there's a shortage of skills and there's a lot of demand for data scientists and some of the creative areas. And you also see growth in the number of jobs in some of the personal services area. Meanwhile, middle skill jobs have really been hit quite hard. These are jobs that involve routine information processing work. So there's been kind of a polarization of the labor market. David Otter and others here at MIT have taken the lead in identifying this. And it's gotten worse over the past about 20 years or so. But another thing to bear in mind is that a lot of that's sort of backward looking. We're looking at what happened with what Andrew McAfee and I sometimes call the first wave of the second machine age, which is teaching computers what we already know, teaching them how to do tax preparation, something where we know the exact details of what needs to be done, and we codify that knowledge. We're now in the early stages of, I think, a much bigger revolution, which is the machine learning revolution, where machines are figuring out on their own what they can do, especially in areas like supervised learning and reinforcement learning, where you can map a set of inputs A into a set of outputs A, like here are images, and let's label them dogs or cats, or here are images of my friends, let's give them the names of their friends, like you see on Facebook now. Or the images could be images of here's cancer, here's not cancer. And you can see how that would affect a pathologist's job. So much more high-end type jobs may be affected going forward. And there have been some incredibly lucrative applications of this, but I think we're only in the early stages of it. So I actually would be a little careful about being just backward looking about the jobs that have been affected over the past 10 or 20 years, and there've been quite a few. Going forward, there's much more rapid changes, and we need to, as I said in an article in Nature 2 weeks ago with Tom Mitchell, we need to develop a lot more metrics of the economy so we can see which parts are being affected in closer to real time.
Speaker DeLeo, do you think about this in terms of Massachusetts? Do you worry? Do you see that there are parts of Massachusetts or parts of the economy, parts of our population that are being left behind? Well, clearly, here we are in the middle of Kendall Square. Some parts of the economy are speeding right ahead, and there's a ton of money flowing in.
Consistently. As a matter of fact, I will tell you that you know, since I did become Speaker of the House, one of the items I've tried to emphasize as Speaker is to try to change what I saw as a tale of two states right here in Massachusetts. You know, I would be traveling, we'll be going to Boston and Cambridge. Then on the same day, I may be going to New Bedford or Springfield or up north to Lawrence and Lowell. And I would see and hear completely different stories in terms of what was going on. The single-digit unemployment rates that I'd be hearing about in Boston and Cambridge were traveling in other parts of the state would be double in terms of what was going on in that particular part of the state. So I learned very quickly, whether I was Chair of Ways and Means at the time or now as Speaker, that this was really something that we had to address. In many places, you know, there was a skills gap. And that's why, as formerly as a Chair of Ways and Means and now a Speaker, I put emphasis on our community colleges, our voc tech schools, to make sure that they're not lost in the equation. Not everyone's going to be going to Harvard or MIT is one of the first things you learn. And I know to the MIT students, I know you couldn't get into Northeastern where I went, but that's all right. That's okay, we'll let that go. But we had to find, you know, they needed a place to go beyond their high school education. And that's what became so important when we tried to put great emphasis on our community colleges and again on our voc tech schools. And that's why I started what was called a business link here in Massachusetts, where I try to get businesses from all over the state, whether from the east or from the west, to come together to try to see some of those businesses who may not be growing at the rate of those in the east, try to see them grow as well. And I can tell you, we have seen some success with that. For instance, recently we saw Greentown Labs now opening up an office at Springfield Technical School in Springfield. So I will, you know, tell you, and not only from hearing from reps, by being around from the states and talking to most importantly, to the business community about that gap, and about that gap not only in skills, but about that gap in employment rates as well.
Shawn, do you want to talk a little bit about what YearHub does? And I wonder if you can speak to what Speaker DeLeo said about, I mean, here in Massachusetts, seeing this idea of like a tale of two states. I'm sure you see that in states all over the country. So talk about what you see and then, you know, what you're trying to do.
Sure, thank you. So I realize I'm probably representing the organization that none of you know anything about. So let me just give you a little headline, and I need to start by thanking the institutions that these three guys represent, because all three of them are employer partners of this national organization called YearHub. And we're the fastest growing youth serving organization founded in this country. We work with 18 to 24-year-old opportunity youth, so-called opportunity youth, who haven't been able to get into the economic mainstream. They have a high school diploma or a GED, but haven't found a way by virtue of only zip code and into which they were born to not figure out a path up. And we partner with employers to give them access to this heretofore unseen extraordinary population of talent. It requires a sort of leap of faith with employers who have a set of views, like we all do, arguably biased about what talent looks like, how it shows up, how it's packaged, where it's been trained. And these employers lean in with us and take these young people who we've spent time with teaching professional and technical skills and bring them into their workforce and internships, and then have an opportunity to have access to hire this talent. And we're doing this now in 16 markets across the United States. Interestingly, in this great institution we're sitting in today, MIT was an early partner of ours in Boston when we started up and made some really interesting first bets, and so I want to thank this institution for that leadership. One of those great bets was on an amazing, now terrific employee of this institution who happens to have recently won a very, I gather, coveted customer service award through the Institute. And he's here today, Greg Walton, standing at the back. So I just wanted to say, hey, Greg. And to say, MIT, you leaned in. And you took a bet on talent that you would have not had access to or seen. And lo and behold, you've got new standard bearers of what talent looks like and how that's infusing your institution's excellence. So to the particular question you asked about, this tale of two states and/or the national divide on this, I think we are driving from the rearview mirror in the United States, and it's partly because we have a set of things in the way of what we've done and the kind of investments we've made, and you spoke to this about the underinvestment we've made in a variety of ways. And I think part of it is that we have what we call 3 Ps that are in the way. We have a set of negative stereotypes and perceptions about young people in general, arguably, and certainly young people of color. We have really interesting class and race divides that allow us to essentially eclipse and not see folks that we need to make sure are in the inclusive economy. And on behalf of many of our young people, they have a negative perception of what's possible for them because they've grown up in communities where they don't know what success looks like. So that perception change is central to the work that we do and central with our employer partners in helping them open up their view and their eyes as they realize that they had all these sort of stereotypes that are in the way of ensuring that they bring great talent into their organizations. The next one is really employer practices, second P, so perceptions and practices. And that set of practices include things like, how do we understand competency? What are the ways in which we currently do our assessment in our seeking? And we have some really interesting, and we'll get to this conversation later, ways in which technology is in the way and could, in fact, really facilitate changing how we actually assess folks. And then how we bring this talent in, grow, support, nurture, and retain. And then the third long, hard P, which you know so well and we're all working on, is the public policy that arguably animates and/or exacerbates how we're spending public resources and the rules of the game. And there's a lot to change there, which we can talk about.
Erik, you work for a company that's obviously tries to be very cutting edge in terms of technology. Give me a sense, this kind of goes back to the question that Erik Brynjolfsson answered, how you see technology and skills changing and the gaps that you see in terms of, young people in America actually being able to be up to those roles that are right around the corner.
It's interesting, just to support your comments, diversity and inclusion are really good business. It's good for your shareholders. And so if you take that as your attitude every day, which we do, and I go to the speaker's description of the two worlds, we see it, and I think it's going to get worse for the reasons that Erik described. A lot of it has to do with basic math skills and so forth. And so we take the view, and I take the view, that corporations need to actually act rather than just sort of sit around and complain. And so in our particular case, we've done a set of initiatives around computer science. We have a program called CS First for fourth graders to eighth graders. We have a Made with Code program that's targeted at teenage girls. 8 million girls have gone through that, trying to get the skills gap closed with young people. We do a lot of other things about getting people online, digital inclusion, and philanthropy in that area. But I think the problem is going to get worse unless we take people and get them in these systems that can ultimately give them a higher probability of getting to MIT level educations. And without that, they're not going to be able to play at the level that Erik described. The gap is getting greater because these systems are getting more sophisticated.
So if you pull back then from just what Google is doing, and you think about, think about Silicon Valley, a lot of, and also the Boston area, New York, a lot of places where people, there's a lot of companies headquartered in these places. in your view, how much can companies do to close the gap? And are they the solution, or are they like a drop in the bucket?
Well, there's lots of problems. Let's start with horrific immigration policies, bad treatment of minorities, the need for education to get reformed. There's a long list like that. So what can companies do? You can lobby on those issues, like H-1B visas and things like that. And then you can act in terms of free access to education, trying to get the sort of seed corn, if you will, built. We have a crisis in our particular industry that the number of people who can do the artificial intelligence, machine learning work that Erik highlighted in his comments is so small that we have to manufacture more. And so what we've been doing is taking physicists and mathematicians who are super, super analytically capable of dealing with these things and educating them in this new phenomena. And the economics for us are such that the return, again, to our customers, to our brand, to our products, is well worth the extra expense. So we are actively doing this training, and we do it internally as well for our own employees. And I suspect this is going to be what all of the tech companies will have to do.
Erik, Brynjolfsson, what do you see as working? I mean, when I was looking at the issue of retraining, so not initial training, retraining, like you had a job and the job became somehow obsolete, or the number of jobs diminished and you lost yours. Retraining, Germany spends about 5 times as much as we do in relation to their GDP, and Denmark spends 20 times what we do. Now, I don't know, give me a sense of where you think the solution has to come from and what you see as the most promising examples that you've seen.
Well, those are 2 great examples, and Erik's example for what's happening at Google is another one. And I think it highlights that there's actually has to be a multi-pronged effort. There is no single silver bullet for this. Companies can benefit tremendously by training and retraining their workers and making sure they're up to skill. In Germany, there's a lot of public-private partnerships, so the big companies will work with universities to help train them. And at MIT, we do a fair amount of that. I was just telling the speaker just before that we started about a program here we have called the Analytics Lab, where we work with companies. They bring in their big data sets, and the students get their first taste of really working with practical problems in machine learning and analytics. Not just stuff on the blackboard, but stuff that's working with managers. And at the end of the semester, they present in a room like this to those managers and get their results tested. Ultimately, a big part of education is what economists call a public good. The companies can benefit and capture some of it, but a lot of it is a societal benefit. And America recognized this more than most countries, earlier than most countries, back in the 1800s when they instituted the first mass public education. It's a big part of the reason that America became such a wealthy nation, but also such a largely egalitarian nation compared to a lot of other countries, because we provided mass public education, first K through 6, K through 12, to some extent at higher levels. But if you go at it at all these different levels, we can improve things. The thing to bear in mind, though, also is it's not just a matter of putting more resources in it. We have an opportunity to reinvent how education is done, partly through online sources and much more personalization and customization of the digital teaching. And we have to reinvent it because a lot of the ways that we taught people in the 20th century were really geared for sort of a mass production, highly repetitive set of tasks. What Henry Ford needed for the assembly line is very different from what people need today. Creativity is much more of a premium, interpersonal skills, teamwork, being able to define a problem and work on projects. Those are things that I think humans can be very good at, and I think most people love doing those kinds of things, but historically it's not been what schools have been emphasizing, so we need some reinvention there as well.
If I can follow up a little bit on that whole issue relative to, shall I say, business and government. Let me bring business and government into it. What I had found, one of the major, when I first became speaker, one of my major things that I wanted to see accomplished was to see business growth here in the Commonwealth. And obviously, in talking to many of the businesses around the state, one of the things that we had started, for instance, was so-called talent pipeline, wherein the state would also make an investment along with the businesses to try to keep the best and the brightest right here in Massachusetts to form their partnership. But what I also found that I don't think people realize was the importance that businesses had relative to various policies that we have accomplished here in Massachusetts, which some folks may not have even thought of. But I can tell you, when it came to issues like transgender rights, when it came to issues, I can tell you more particularly like early education right now. Once we formed that partnership with business, things started to grow. Early education, just a prime example of that most recently. One of the things that I had seen some 2 or 3 years back was I really didn't think that we were making a real proper investment in early education. In particularly, making that investment relative to the teachers in early education. We're talking folks who are getting paid some $25,000 a year, and we're asking them to prepare our youngsters for the world of education and the jobs of tomorrow. And one of the things I called upon, I first worked in partnership with the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. And they said, hey, do you want to get involved, relative to this subject matter? And I didn't know what their answer, quite frankly, would be. And I got this large outpouring of support from the Greater Boston Chamber, the Mass Business Roundtable, and so on and so forth. And this year, we're making our largest investment in early education that we have ever made in this state. And it's something, after we started to talk about, has taken off, so to speak. And what I'm saying is the importance of bringing, business into the discussion, whether it's that, whether it's next week, I hope to do a bill, which some of you may have heard about, the Pregnant Workers' Rights Act. I brought businesses in to talk about how we can make this, how we can make it work. So business plays such a very important part in terms of the policy that we have here in Massachusetts.
I was going to say about early childhood education, you wouldn't necessarily think that's connected to what we're talking about, but I remember several years ago interviewing a teacher, and she said by age 5, kids can show up and there are huge gaps between the haves and the have-nots. And I said, by kindergarten, kids are behind? And the answer was, yeah. If you've got one kid with a really great preschool situation and another kid without, things can already start.
Well, what's amazing is if you
up.
take a look at statistics, you take an early education, for instance, and you say, okay, well, you're preparing the kid for kindergarten. Very, very good. Or but if you take a look at the statistics in terms of how well they do, anywhere from 3rd grade on to high school on to college, it's amazing how much better that child with early education will do than the child without an early education. And the statistic that really caught my attention was the fact that when you take a look at incarceration rates, which we are spending quite a bit of time right now, those children with an early education have a much lower ratio of incarceration rates than those without. So when I got these businesses together, and I was somewhat surprised, because I said, well, you'd be more interested in higher education than you are sitting here with me talking about early ed. And they said, no, not at all, because we look at this as one of the most important parts of our economy, and most importantly, the future of our economy here in Massachusetts.
Shawn, do you want to talk a little bit about, well, I'm interested in 2 things. One is, what are employers coming to, you work with so many employers, what are they coming to you and saying, this is what we have a need for? But the other is that question that we were asking about the role of businesses and how much they can do. You and I were talking before this about, like, once upon a time, big businesses would have almost apprenticeship programs. You'd get hired, but they'd spend a little while like trying to train you. So talk a little bit about the role of businesses and what they are asking you for.
So I think we're probably in violent agreement on this panel about the really important role of employers and businesses in advocating for and being activist around ensuring that we have the talent trained and in the economy, and that starts arguably even before early childhood education, in terms of healthy families and healthy communities. That said, what we're finding we work with about 250 employers across the nation, including institutions of higher education and health. And the dominant thing we hear, we're generally providing entry-level talent for what we think of as middle-skill jobs, and primarily in IT and back-office financial services, although obviously massive growing efforts in certain parts of the country and for every company and employer in cybersecurity. And what we are hearing from employers steadily, and this is true over the last 17 years, is what they find is that young people coming to them from any variety of sources, including esteemed institutions like this one, are really missing what we think of as pro skills, professional skills. They may have extraordinary technical skills, but the fundamental skills that Erik outlined, creativity, problem solving, working well with others, giving and receiving feedback, thinking outside the box. A handful of things that are absolutely central to being effective in a workplace is inherently about collaboration and working well with others and moving ideas forward, as opposed to this much more automated way in which we were, imagining work was and probably no longer will be. And so part of what's really important in this year-long program is the experiential piece, when our young people are working in a company, interning, and essentially working side by side with folks really watching and learning how to do it in the context of what that enterprise and business needs. I would say the other thing, sort of meta thing we're seeing as a sort of broken piece for many companies, really across industry, is the sort of entry-level to first-line supervisor, which this is now ubiquitous across a national effort we're doing under the aegis of Grads of Life, which is a national sort of clearinghouse and public awareness campaign about this population of opportunity youth, which numbers about 5.5 million, 6 million young people in this country who are not in the game, and helping employers see this population as talented, and then a lot of employers saying, how do we build pipelines to bring these young people in? And most of these companies have imagined people came in the door, and then they would be working towards first-line supervisor, and that is central to sort of a career pathway, livable wage job, and they currently have nothing working there. One of the things that's interesting about employers, and this sort of gets to where we're going to go, I'm sure, with the data conversation, is a lot of employers really do not spend a lot of time with their own internal data about understanding where their talent actually comes from and what the great sources of talent are. So when you're sitting talking with folks in HR, they can't really distinguish from their different hiring pathways what the greatest successes are, and therefore really make strong bets around what constitutes a good ROI. And obviously, to my left, Erik is talking about it in a very sophisticated way, rare, I would say, in the conversations we're having with employers. But how much is that actually driving not just top of the line, high-end jobs, but really arguably all the way down through the labor force to the entry level? So I would say to the what you've done here and what Erik had alluded to, we're starting to see employers come together in industry and even cross-industry in regions and sort of say, what do we need to be doing in the ecosystem that we're operating in, which could be global or it could be local in a region, to actually ensure that there is a really rich, thick fabric to ensure that everybody can get into the game. Because someone may be working for Erik, and then work for me, and then work for Erik, and then work for the speaker, and that's actually likely the way employment is going to go. And so it's on all of us together, cross-sectorally, to be ensuring that we really have everybody skilled up.
Erik, I wonder, when you think about high-need populations, what you've seen work best in terms of scaling. Like, how do you, obviously, if you get a great bunch of volunteers from a place like Google, they can do a lot, but how have you seen things work best in terms of scaling things up and really changing a community or a network of communities?
Well, I'm not sure we're representative of the general case. Mm-hmm. We have a very, very explicit hiring process, which is pretty brutal. And it involves, very detailed analysis of the candidates and a peer-based scoring system. And we've had various successes. We had one fella who we interviewed 16 times before we said no to him. And so you can build there's like an error. And so you can build systems that can not waste his time and therefore ours, and find the right people, and then we actually back solve against their performance. And there's a series of books about how doing this. And if you're running a company, you should at least study how we do it. It really works well. I've actually been thinking, Erik and I have been talking for a long time about the nature of these jobs. And while I would like everyone to become a PhD in computer science, I think it's unrealistic, even if the #1 major at MIT is computer science, so thank you very much. It's an unrealistic goal, across the broad population. But there's a different goal that might be achievable, which is a vast majority of, I'm going to call them normal people, as opposed to computer scientists, are going to be able to program computer systems to do powerful things. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that at the moment we're in a bespoke world of research where these new mechanisms require incredibly complicated judgment, highly specialized skills. And by the way, the same thing was true of the original building of airplanes, and other things. And once the subroutines, once the procedures, once the submodules were all sort of figured out, they became accessible to mere mortals. And what I hope will be true in the next 5 to 10 years is that people with good organizational skills and good analytical skills will be able to program at the level that I could when I was a practicing computer scientist. And you say, how is that possible without a degree? And the answer is because the intelligence can be put below them and then they can just exploit it. In other words, if you think of the way to understand our language is we're building systems that learn to learn. Yeah. It should be possible for every single person to be able to build a system that learns something that's useful to them.
I'll start with Erik here, but I'm interested in what you think about this too. Mm-hmm. How do you make sure that if you're funding programs or if you're supporting programs, that we're not in such a rapidly changing world in terms of technology, that you're not training people to learn X computer language now, and in 7 years when they go to apply it, their employer says, yeah, we've moved on from that?
Well, hopefully the people we're talking about are sufficiently flexible and creative that they can move with the technology. I used to have a rule in computer science that computer scientists would learn everything they did below the age of 35, and then they would resist changing any computer language after the age of 35. Right? That was sort of my observation. And that needs to not be true going forward for the reasons you described. And here at MIT and other places, there are huge new powerful languages being developed that abstract many of the things that bedeviled me as a programmer. And I want people to use them. But I think that if you assume that success in life comes from a combination of persistence and curiosity, so the people who are most persistent and most curious will follow through that set of choices pretty well. And remember that now with Google and other services, every conceivable question that you could ask is answerable very quickly, literally on your laptop or phone.
Sure. Let me make 3 quick points on that. The first is when you're teaching things, we try to teach both the abstraction as well as the specific case. So you may learn a particular language, but hopefully you're also learning some broader underlying principles. In my courses when I teach economics, and in my new book with Andy, Machine Platform Crowd, if I'll put a plug in for that, we have lots of very concrete examples of companies that have been successful or not successful. We don't just leave it at that. We say, this is an example of a broader principle. And the hope is that the student will understand, or the reader will understand, okay, that particular company or language is no longer relevant 5 years later, but the underlying principle carries forward. The second point I'd like to make is that in addition to the tremendous increase in demand for people who are problem solvers, the creative skills, who are engineers in a way, who can take a problem that's facing a society or a company and craft a solution to it in a computer language or otherwise, there are a whole set of other skills, as the speaker and Shawn was saying, about interpersonal and human skills, requiring high emotional intelligence. And I think that's going to be one of the most rapidly growing categories going forward. Most of us don't want a machine to be our soccer coach or to taking care of the kids in our preschool. And so there are all sorts of interpersonal skills, sales, negotiation, leadership, teamwork, teaching that I think will grow quite a bit. And there's lots of opportunities for people to learn those. And then the last point, learned from Alan Blue at LinkedIn, was that there's a spectrum that some of the harder skills are easier to teach. You can be very concrete, and Sebastian Thrun has great success with these nano degrees at Udacity. But some of the softer skills, although they're harder to bring out, they tend to be more lasting. And so we want to have a mix, and they're both demanded by the marketplace. But we don't want to just only focus on the very concrete, harder skills. I think if we go work for the whole spectrum, we're more likely to have people who are valuable to society and therefore employable for a longer time.
It's interesting. I'll get Shawn's view on this too, but I wonder, you talked about Udacity, and I feel like for a while there was this whole real excitement about online learning and that people were going to take these massive open online courses, MOOCs. Remember that? Yep. And I'm sure they are, they're still out there, obviously. But it also, as we saw data come in, we realized, well, it's not really a person. You're not showing up. No teacher actually cares if you're there. And the dropout rates are just enormous.
Right.
And I wonder, are there ways?
Can I disagree with a little bit with the premise of your question? Udacity is a huge success today, right? Enormous numbers of people are using micro courses around specific areas. And again, we fall into this trap of thinking that education is only one mechanism. We want education of every kind, in every way, exactly personalized to the student. And eventually, maybe we'll be able, using AI, to build that sort of concoction, if you will, that's perfect for you. But nobody thought that somehow the MOOCs would displace universities. They're additive, right? And who wants to deny the 90% of the people on the MOOCs are typically outside the country, often in the developing world? I'd much rather have them be educated from MIT courses, such as the edX program, which we help sponsor, than having them figuring out locally.
Yes. So let me just add to that part of what has made Udacity a success is its ability. Yes, they've had some success with MOOCs, but they're also constantly experimenting and learning, and they are adjusting what they're doing. And the main lesson I take away from some of the online learning, and Anand Agarwal with MITx and edX has emphasized this, is the way you can get very quick feedback about what's working and what's not working. And so you end up having a much more nimbler educational process where parts of it, for some types of material, actually MOOCs work quite well. For other types of material, there's not a good success. And having that agility to learn from the data is a big part of the success of the general digital infrastructure.
I'll give you one more example. Everybody here has spent their time doing math problems that seemed crazy and were kind of like painful. Khan Academy and a number of other companies figured out, using completion rates, what is the minimum set of such math problems that you have to answer in order to understand calculus. Now that's a serious achievement. Again, using the data metrics, using measurement in teaching, right, what a concept, you can actually produce a more efficient learning mechanism that works for everybody.
John, I wonder, if you think, when you think about rural areas or underserved areas.
I would just say it works for everybody. I would just take a little bit of pause with that. Although I agree with everything you said until then. I think our experience in working with a population of young people for whom traditional public education, for the most part, did not ensure that they were going to get to market labor attachment, which is arguably the end goal, to be able to take care of yourself and those you have responsibility for economically, is that it's, and while I think what we can do and will continue to do with technology in the variety of ways you guys have been talking about seems central, we have found that the human piece that is both the peer learning cohort model in the sharing of responsibility and ways of understanding and learning is central for this population of young people to actually be successful. And the context of the actual work environment as opposed to the abstraction. So it's not just abstract and specific, but then applied. And that goes back to the sort of perception framework around what's possible for me. So I wouldn't necessarily know what it wowould mean to be practically working with a PhD in computer science, for instance, if I didn't spend some time, it was out of my context, but if I could see someone doing the work and it was of interest to me, I could imagine why it would be worth struggling through even if a more efficient way of understanding calculus. And it's that contextualized learning experience which we haven't figured out a way yet to have that be, for all populations, arguably, simulated outside the context of actual real work and human interaction. And that may be an area that, if we're thinking about efficiency and effectiveness and scale and distribution and inclusivity, we could aim some energy at. But we've found you need a combination of those things. And back to soft skills, or pro skills, as we call them, professional skills, we think of those as the hard and harder skills, and most employers that we speak with, that's the specific thing. People are hired for skills and they're fired for attitude and behavior. And attitude and behavior is essentially central in the pro skills. So that piece is like a cornerstone, arguably, starting in preschool, learning to play well with others, up through into adulthood.
Yeah, it's fascinating to listen. My computer skills probably start from getting 81 votes on a particular matter. So mine's extremely limited. I guess I'm never going to get that job at Google for 16 interviews. I doubt that will happen. But one of the things that I failed to mention, one of the other things, when we just completed a budget. And when you take a look at the budget that we just completed, what I look at is the most important things that we have to do. Probably number one is to make sure that we provide for the most neediest amongst us, okay? The disabled or, whatever the issue may be, that we provide for the neediest. Secondly, I think we also have to make sure that it's fiscally sound, that the bond rating agencies are going to accept it and make sure that we keep that type of fiscal stability here. Also, I think one of the, finally, the other thing is the investments that we make here in Massachusetts as well. The things that are going to help us grow as a state. And I know you just talked about computer scientists and whatnot, but I can tell you one of the bigger investments that we've made and ideas that we've come up with within the last couple of years has been the so-called STEM Starter Academy right here in Massachusetts, where we saw some of the there was a lacking, shall we say, and we heard that from the business community, that the students were not being educated enough in science, technology, engineering, and math. And I can tell you that that has worked extremely well. For instance, I had visited Genzyme, I don't know, last year or so, and what's fascinating and interesting about that is you had students, I think it was Mass Bay Community College, who were starting at an entry-level position at Genzyme. But not only were they doing that, these students also, once they began their studies there, wanted to further their education and move up the ladder, so to speak. So I think that investments that we make here in Massachusetts with things like the STEM Starter Academy, what I mentioned in early education, the talent pipeline, I find those to be very important in terms of where we are economically and how we can see business grow here in Massachusetts.
I want to ask you a follow-up on that, but first let me mention there are microphones in both of the aisles, and we want to take some of your questions. So if you have a question, just line up behind the microphone, and we will go to it in a minute or two. Do you see states as being, when you think about the government, I don't know if it's mayors, I don't know if it's states, the federal government, or networks of states, even regional, regional leaders, but is it states that you think are going to be the leaders on thinking about how do we bring, high-tech manufacturing here, which means we need this pool of people, which we don't have, so we're going to create a high school. That's, is this states that are sort of leading the charge on luring these jobs and educating a workforce?
First of all, I have no idea in terms of federal government. I have no idea what's going on in federal government right now. But that'd be another story for another day, I guess. So we could talk about that. That'd be a separate discussion. But yes, I mean that's what I hear. Okay, and that's what I want to hear. That's what I want to hear from the businesses, because too often I hear about the fact that they've got jobs in Massachusetts they can't be filled because the children aren't learning enough. They're not prepared. They're not being prepared properly. So I think that's, again, that relationship between, again, I keep on coming back to it, that partnership between business and government, I think is so important. If we're going to see our state grow, then we have to hear that. And, I'm constantly talking to, whether it's president of our universities, our colleges, our community colleges, our university system, our private schools, obviously, as well, trying to get them together to talk in terms of what roles they're going to play. For instance, I had visited a community college at a symposium, considered one of the Miami-Dade community colleges, and they spend most of their time, working with businesses to see what is the need out there. And I think it's so important that we as a government really hear what those needs are. Today is a lot different from when I started as a state representative. Last year, for instance, one of the biggest issues we dealt with, if you remember, was Uber and Lyft. This year I can see it's probably going to be Airbnb. It's going to be one of the major issues. With the ever-increasing technology and the ever changes that we're making, we as a government have to change with that. And we have to make sure that the budget that we have, that the investments that we make in education are keeping up with those changes as well.
Can I just add a coda to this? Because I would say, I agree with what you've said. I would just go a level further to say what we're actually spending public funding on and what we want to hold people accountable to produce or deliver is really central to ensure that the partnership between business and government creates the results, for instance, an educated, talented, tech-savvy workforce. And one of the big things that I think is central to reform, whether we're talking at the local level up to the federal, given the way money flows and doesn't flow, is really thinking about shifting from really an input-based way in which we finance things, which again is really rear-view mirror driving. We'll put a little bit of tiny money in here, you take 3 weeks of Excel and boom, you're all of a sudden gonna be a really effective computer programmer. No, but we actually get our gaze on the same thing. So our gaze should really be on a W-2 that grows over time. That's what the employee wants. That's what the employer wants to assure when we connect demand and supply. And then we need, in terms of the way we're financing it, which is arguably multi-sectorally, but with public as a not small piece of it, to ensure that we're actually paying people for outcomes. We're paying folks, providers and others, be they educators in the community college system or the private university system or in the community-based organization system, and all of the wraparound services to support learning to ensure that we're actually paying for outcomes that are really going to meet businesses' needs. We're not doing that now at all.
There's a question right over here. It looks like, oh, there we go.
Hi there. I think we're on. First, thank you so much for the perspectives. My name is Gray McCune, and I'm a graduate student here at MIT Sloan. I was interested if you could share a little bit more about geography and specifically geographic mobility. I'm interested in how you are each thinking about the tension between bringing the work to people and bringing people to the work. And why I say that is, we spoke about these two states and how there might be some divisions here, but we also know from the technology perspective that there are often cluster advantages in having expertise in certain places, and that those places may be even more competitive than places that lack that. So how do you see those tensions kind of working out? What do you think is perhaps a more ideal state, maybe just in Massachusetts or more globally?
That's a great question. Erik, Brynjolfsson, you want to start?
Sure. One of the surprising things that I came across in the research was that how much geographic mobility has fallen in the United States and how we're not moving as much as we used to. And that's a problem because often the jobs aren't where the people are and skills aren't evenly distributed. And this has led to some real mismatches. And one would hope that the digital revolution would make geography irrelevant, but that hasn't happened. It's almost the opposite. It's become even more spiky. But there are some really encouraging examples. Actually, Speaker DeLeo mentioned how different some of the economic conditions are in Lowell than just here around Cambridge, not very far apart. But there are some green shoots in Lowell. One of the winners of the Inclusive Innovation Challenge last year was a company called 99 Degrees Custom that brought some new technology to Lowell to do, of all things, textiles. If you remember those from the 1800s, we thought they'd all left. They started here. Lowell was called the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution. We thought they all went overseas to low-wage places, but they're bringing them back. And the people there are doing some creative work because the machines are much more flexible. And instead of just having the same shirt made over and over, there's a lot more customization now that's possible. And that requires a slightly higher level of skill and more talent in the workforce. They're paid more. They're not the same numbers of tens of thousands of jobs that we had before, but it's an example where that geography is benefiting a lot from these new technologies.
We also see that with venture capital dollars, just getting more and more scrunched onto a few places on the map. I mean, Erik, I'll ask you, when you talk to business leaders, do people seem concerned about the skills gap, or do they seem at least for now, like they're doing pretty well and things are going okay where they are.
Well, the talent shortage drives everything.
Okay.
If you look at the leading tech companies, the leverage of their brands, which are very strong, and their reach, which is global, another 50 or 100 people who could build a new product is perfect economics. They just can't get the 50 to 100 people, or they don't have offices for them because they don't have any more buildings. So we just live in a different kind of world based on innovation. And I think this is a permanent change. I think innovation will always be driven by people who are at the edge. And what I would comment about this sort of locality is that Silicon Valley needs a competitor. The obvious competitor is the greater Cambridge-Boston area. It has been so for a long time. If you look at funding flow, it's Silicon Valley first, this area second. In biotech, it's the inverse, right? So we have a success model and a second success model, and it needs a lot of emphasis from the government. This is an incredible engine for the benefit of all, speaker, for the entire state that you have here. I think of you as the college town of America, right, in terms of the number of colleges and so forth and so on. Where better, right, to encourage innovation, entrepreneurship, with government policies that allow for venture investment and so forth. I think it's all achievable, and it's all achievable right here.
That's why, by the way, when you talk about, whenever I talk about businesses coming to Massachusetts, if you want to talk about one of the latest, the General Electric move to Massachusetts. And I will tell you that, first of all, I think there were a lot of monetary incentives, I think that were, I'm sorry, thank you very much, that were much greater from other states than where we're Massachusetts. But the thing I think that attracted, one of the major items was the fact about our education and the talented workforce that we have right here in Massachusetts. And I think that's so important. And now I think when you talk about transportation, I think you have to talk about transportation within the Commonwealth as well as being important. To get folks, maybe we can grow, we'll say up in Lowell, maybe we can grow in Worcester or wherever, as long as people have a way, to get there. Yeah. And I think that that's one of the other major issues that we have to come to grips with as a state.
Questions up here. Is there one on this side or not yet? So let's go over to this side if we've got one, and then we'll come back right over here.
Hi, Erik. I'm Naomi Stephen. I work at the Sloan School. This question, I think it's a bit to the side of what IIC tries to do, but it also seems to me to pull in pretty much things that everybody's been saying. You talk about soft skills, about creativity, thinking outside the box, problem solving, things that computers can't do, about job creation, about teaching people skills that are sustainable through changes in technology. And I'm putting that together with many, many articles that I've read over the past 2, 3, 4 years about increasing shortages of skilled trade workers, people like electricians, plumbers, house builders, roofers, people who need to figure out, for instance, idiosyncratic Cambridge apartment setups and how to solve those problems and fix them. I'm thinking also about what you mentioned in your book, The Second Machine Age, Erik, about how the kinds of jobs that machines can't do yet, like a home health aide, someone who can climb a flight of stairs and minister to a bewildered 80-year-old effectively and sympathetically. Those sorts of things that can't be done by machines, at least in the foreseeable future. Businesses need to be involved in those. Obviously, public policy needs to be involved in those. I'm not sure if YearHub is focusing mostly on the kinds of IT, tech training jobs, corporate jobs, or if there's room in all of these conceptions that all of you have talked about for those sorts of skilled trades areas.
Erik, do you want to talk a little bit about what the gaps, and then we'll get to Europe, but what the big gaps are that maybe we're missing? Like you were talking about plumbing and are there things, computer science is great and we should be teaching it, but are there other things we should really be talking more about?
Well, there's a whole spectrum. So I think sometimes people think of this one-dimensional spectrum, sometimes called skill bias technical change, that technology is affecting less skilled jobs and there's more demand for high skilled jobs, and that's a mass oversimplification. It's not even really correct anymore. It's really very multidimensional, and as Naomi was saying, there's a whole bunch of other dimensions and types of skilled trades and others, and interpersonal skills that are incredibly valuable. They may or may not require lots of advanced education. They may require expertise on all sorts of other dimensions. I'd love to hear what Shawn is doing and how that fits in.
So when I think broadly about the folks doing the training and the skill development, and I think about that in the sort of supply intermediaries for talent in the provider community, which includes higher education, the incredible community college, quote unquote, system, which is about 1,100 institutions across the US, and then many, many community-based organizations, and then the trades. It's a really fragmented non-system. And I know from our work with national employers, there are very few national providers who can actually meet the needs of an employer who might be operating in 30 markets. And so part of what, and again, what the providers think their job is and what they need to train people to do, not necessarily paid for or their gaze on ensuring market attachment and employment to a current and or future job. That's part of what needs to be sorted. And so we've made a massive underinvestment in VOTEC, which we're doing a better job in Massachusetts, but arguably we need to do that in general. The other thing that a lot of these industries are starting to take on really is we went for strategically in this country a college for all, for college, privileging that education as if it were the thing, and really making less any other choices in terms of careers. And I know there are a handful of national associations that are essentially going to do some rebranding about what are the cool new jobs. And we heard a great example, this cool company in Lowell, where you could imagine modern textile work and or manufacturing is actually really interesting, technically sophisticated career pathway jobs. And we need to rethink and reimagine what the current and future work is. And as for the people piece you talked about, the poignant little moment you gave us of someone who very competently can walk up those stairs and care for compassionately and effectively an 80-year-old who needs assistance, we're going to have more and more of those needs as we age and live longer. And so figuring out what it means to honor, as with the folks working in elementary ed, honor those workers and ensure they actually can make a living and can get to work. Those are central infrastructure pieces that we haven't done a very good job on in this country. That is part of the public policy we should all be working on.
And before we get to the end here, Erik, I know that Google.org is announcing today more support for this idea of an inclusive economy. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Actually, we're very happy to announce a $500,000 grant to the innovation group.
I'm sorry we didn't get to that last question up there, and I see more questions here. I feel like we could easily, if we had the time, we could easily do another hour, an hour and a half. Thank you. We sort of only scratched the surface, but I want to thank the panel so much for taking the time to talk about this. And I hope this is a conversation that we all keep having and you all keep having, because I think it's very important. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kara. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.